Hi, I'm Tim Tyler, a broker salesperson for Coldwell Banker Realty in Maplewood, New Jersey, a licensed real estate instructor, and a trained historian. And in this episode of House Talk, I'm pulling all of that together to explain some of the changes I see happening in our industry and answer that question: when are things going to go back to normal? Hear that a lot. When is housing going to go back to normal? And by normal, mostly what people talk about is the way that homes used to be sold. How is that? Well, buyers would go out, they'd look at 10, 20 houses. They'd narrow it down to 2 or 3 maybe that they would go back and see again. Then they would prepare and submit an offer that the seller would look at, and maybe the seller would accept it, maybe they would reject it, or they might counter offer, in which case then the buyer might counter, and we would go back and forth a few times until we came to an agreement on the price and the terms. I'll call this the negotiated sale process. That was the normal for most of the past century, and probably long before that. But in the last 3 years, we've seen something very different. Very few homes have actually sold through that process. Instead, what happens today is a home comes on the market. Everybody who's looking comes through to see it in the first week or so, and the bids start rolling in. Anyone who that's the perfect house for them, it'll meet their needs, they're desperate, and they just want to get anything, is throwing in an offer. The seller then goes through all these offers, looks for either the highest price or the one that meets the most of their needs and demands with the highest price, and they move forward with little or no negotiation whatsoever. So that's what people are asking. When are we going to go back to that old way instead of this new way, which I'll call the bid auction method because it's very similar to an auction? And my answer to that, after looking at this for some time, is I'm not sure we're ever going back. This might be the new normal. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, why are we where we are now? And most people believe that, it's because of COVID and, nobody wanted to sell their house, and so we've got, very little inventory. A few people understand that very low inventory actually has been the case for a while now. There's been this underbuilding of homes over the last decade or so. And that's one of the reasons why there's so little to sell and why so many buyers are chasing so few properties. What I am here to tell you is that I don't think that that's the whole story. I don't think COVID has all that much to do with it. And the reason for the low inventory is much deeper than many people realize. For one thing, it's become much more expensive to build homes today. And so what homes are being built are usually very large luxury homes, not the starter homes that most buyers are looking for. Because the profit margin for builders for those small homes it's non-existent. So until we address those issues, we're not likely to see a change in the inventory for quite some time. And if we look to the past, we can see just about how long that might be. In the 20th century, we went through something very similar. In 1915, as World War II broke out over Europe, prices of materials for home building skyrocketed here, even in the United States, as material was diverted to the war effort. And then a couple of years later, we sent 1 million men to Europe, which had a huge impact on the labor market and caused prices to rise even further. And even when everybody came home from World War I, prices stayed very high. It was very expensive to build homes, and so we underbuilt throughout the entire 1920s. And then we had a depression, so we underbuilt through the entire 1930s. And then we had another World War, and it wasn't until 1947 that we began to catch up with the deficit of housing that we had at that time. A period of 32 years. It's a third of a century. So we may not see the inventory problem resolve here for another decade or two even. So if you're thinking of waiting until things normalize, do you have 20 years to wait? The other problem is also this. Even if inventory comes back on, I'm not so sure that we're going to see the house buying process go back to the way it used to be. Why? Well, because there's been other changes in our industry as well. The real estate industry has gone through a number of changes over the past century, very similar to the Industrial Revolution. Back in the 18th and 19th century, real estate was the wild, wild west. There were very few, if any, laws. There was no organizations to impose ethical standards or anything like that. It wasn't until the early part of the 20th century, the first 2 decades of that 20th century, when we began to see some changes. In 1906, a man by the name of Colbert Colwell, appalled by the real estate practices that he saw in the wake of the earthquake in San Francisco in that year, formed a company, a real estate company, that is today Coldwell Banker. And he did that with the idea of setting an ethical standard for the business. 2 years later, a number of like-minded brokers met in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I believe, and founded an organization that has come to be known today as the National Association of Realtors. And 5 years later, in 1913, they issued the first code of ethics for our industry. In that same year, 1913, New Jersey became one of the first states to issue real estate licenses, form a real estate commission, and begin passing laws that regulated the industry. For the next several decades, most or all of the states eventually in the United States followed suit. So we had that first revolution, the professionalization of real estate. But during that time, everyone worked for the seller. The seller paid the commission, so the seller was who we worked with and who we were giving our ethical responsibilities to. The buyer, they were on their own. It wasn't until the 1980s that we began to look at that and say, maybe the buyer should have some sort of representation in this whole business too. And so we began the process of buyer representation. That spread through much more quickly. It took about 10 to 20 years for that to become the norm in the business. Then we got buyer representation. And then, 2000, a couple of years after that, we began to see another huge shift in our industry. This little thing called the internet. All of a sudden, buyers could see all the homes that were in the market. Everything that was up on the internet, they could see, so they could decide where they wanted to go. Up until that time, we, as real estate agents, controlled what they could see, what they had access to. Yes, in the 1960s, the Fair Housing Act forbid practices like steering, but still, buyers didn't really know what was out there, so we still really controlled where they looked and ultimately where they ended up living. It wasn't until the internet came out that hold that we had on the inventory was broken. And that brings us to today. Today, we see another shift happening. So when I said the internet came in, I only talked about buyers. Today, sellers have discovered the internet, and it has changed how they look at the market in several different ways. First of all, that internet now allows them to work from home. So they have much less or much different motivations for selling homes today. If I get a new job, so what? I'll just continue to work from here. So that's one of the things. And they can also see, just like those buyers can, they can now see what's going on in the market, and they can time their sale to their best advantage as well. Add to that the addition of these institutional buyers who are coming out buying homes for rental purposes. And I don't think we're going to get back to a point where we have a glut of homes in the market anytime in the future. And I suspect, while we may not stay with this crazy bid auction system, in the long term, we're never really going to go back to that nice leisurely experience where the buyer could look around at a number of homes and see them several times and negotiate back and forth with the seller. Yeah, there'll be a few sales that take place like that. But I don't think that's ever again going to be the primary means of buying a home. I'm Tim Tyler, and if you're thinking of buying or selling a home, even in this crazy market, give me a call or shoot me a text, 973-462-4079. I'm ready to help you, and remember, when you find Tim, you'll find home. If you learned something from this video, do me a favor and click the like button below. And if you have any questions about anything we talked about in this video, or have ideas for new topics for us to talk about, put those in the comments. And finally, subscribe to the House Talk New Jersey YouTube channel so you'll get updated whenever we put new videos in here explaining how to buy and sell real estate in the state of New Jersey.